Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Tim Huxley, Executive Director of the Asia Office of the International Institute for Strategic Studies here in Singapore. It's a huge pleasure to welcome you to the 32nd IISS Fullerton Lecture, which will be delivered shortly by Chrystia Freeland, Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs. This afternoon, I'd like to welcome not just our established friends and locally based IISS members in the audience, but also those guests who haven't attended one of our IISS Fullerton lectures previously. A warm welcome to you all. For the benefit of those watching this Fullerton lecture remotely, I should mention that we're holding this event in the ballroom of the imposing and historic Fullerton Hotel, located in the heart of Singapore's financial district, not very far from the IISS Asia office. The spirit and purpose of this distinguished lecture series is to promote informed and intelligent debate in Singapore and beyond on matters of international importance from an international perspective. The first Fullerton lecture was delivered in 2012 by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and since then a succession of presidents, prime ministers, cabinet ministers, and other movers and shakers in international affairs has spoken from this platform. We're honored this afternoon to have Chrystia Freeland with us as our Fullerton lecturer. She became Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs in January 2017, having been in the cabinet as Minister of International Trade since 2015. Ms. Freeland was elected to Parliament in 2013, having previously won recognition as a distinguished journalist with the Financial Times, the Globe and Mail, and with Reuters, and as an award-winning author. Her 2012 book, Plutocrats, The Rise of the New Global Super-Rich and the Fall of Everyone Else, was a New York Times bestseller, winner of the 2013 Lionel Gelber Prize for Non-Fiction Reporting on Foreign Affairs, and the 2013 National Business Book Award for the Best Canadian Business-Related Book. The topic that the Minister will address today could not be more important for either Canada or the world. In this region, as in the transatlantic realm, the rules-based international order is being challenged by the revisionist behavior of some states, including large and powerful ones, as well as smaller ones, such as North Korea with its nuclear weapon and missile programs. At the same time, there are signs of potentially dangerous fractures in the solidarity of those countries which have taken the lead in promoting and extending the rules-based order over the last 70 years. Canada has, during that time, played an important role in creating and supporting the present international order. So we're very fortunate today to have the opportunity to hear Canada's perspective from one of those best qualified to present it. Minister, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I was looking at the height of the podium with some trepidation, so thank you for that step. Well, thank you very much, Tim. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the very kind introduction. And thank you very much for inviting me to deliver this lecture. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I know your days are very busy, and it's so nice to see such a great turnout. Merci beaucoup pour l'invitation. C'est un très grand plaisir pour moi d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui. Et c'est un très grand plaisir pour moi d'être ici à Singapore. Just 3 months ago, I was in Bangladesh to address the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, Council of Foreign Ministers, and this is actually my 4th visit to Asia in the past year. It is really great to be back again, and I'm looking forward to the ASEAN meetings later this week. Southeast Asia is a dynamic and thriving part of the world, and a region that actually has a lot in common with my own country, Canada. Canada is home to more than 1 million people from Southeast Asia, and those communities enrich our national life every day and greatly contribute to one of my country's greatest strengths, which is our diversity. And that is a characteristic of very many Southeast Asian countries as well. Singapore, where we are today, Indonesia, Malaysia, for example. Nations that are homes to myriad ethnic groups with distinct languages, cultures, and religions. I really wanted to start by pausing for a moment and saluting our partners in Southeast Asia for showing us all how diverse societies, and indeed a larger diverse region, can find strength not despite their differences, but because of them. This embrace of diversity is a value that Canada deeply shares. And at a time when many countries are being seduced by the siren song of divisive nationalism, our shared commitment to pluralism is something to celebrate and to stand up for. After all, Southeast Asia knows far too well the bloody toll that nativism can exact. As a Pacific nation that has a permanent diplomatic presence in all 10 ASEAN member states, Canada deeply values the stronger ties we have forged with our Southeast Asian partners over the past 4 decades, and we believe that our partnership is needed now more than ever. Today, both Canada and ASEAN confront unprecedented geopolitical and geoeconomic uncertainty. North Korea's pursuit of nuclear weapons continues to undermine regional and global peace and stability, as Tim mentioned. And Canada was very pleased at the beginning of this year to co-host with the United States a summit on peace and security on the Korean Peninsula in Vancouver. The increasing militarization of the South China Sea threatens regional security in a vitally important area which Canada, ASEAN, and much of the world rely on for trade. Equally worrying is the fact that the global trading system, upon which so much of our shared prosperity is based, is being put to the test as never before. And in seeking to fund their massive infrastructure needs, developing countries confront increasingly coercive debt-trap diplomacy, which threatens their sovereignty and erodes the open investment principles thanks to which countries like Singapore have thrived. These challenges risk undermining the rules-based international order upon which Canada and our Southeast Asian partners depend, and which together we have helped to build. And that's the topic that I want to focus on today, the weakening of the rules-based international order. The multilateral system that arose from the chaos and rubble of 2 world wars was built on shared values and standards, a commitment to pluralism, human rights, and the rule of law, and the collective pursuit of a better, safer, more just, and more prosperous world. In Asia, multilateral institutions such as ASEAN arose from a determination to deepen cooperation on trade and security. The ASEAN community, which has ushered in an unprecedented era of peace and prosperity in Southeast Asia, stands as a testament to the promise of international rules and multilateral institutions which bind countries together. ASEAN's achievements are particularly impressive given the grim starting point. The legacy of colonialism and the great power struggles of the 20th century set the stage for devastating civil conflicts throughout this region. Indeed, in 1967, when ASEAN was formed, this was one of the most troubled parts of the world. As veteran Singaporean diplomat Bilahari Kasian has observed, and I quote, "All 5 ASEAN countries face Chinese-inspired, if not directly backed, internal communist insurgencies. At the same time, almost every member of the 5 original ASEAN members was at the other's throat. Almost all the Southeast Asian states were artificial entities whose boundaries were established only during the colonial era, still imperfectly integrated, and therefore subject to fits of insecurely insistent nationalism." Hardly promising. Yet, thanks to a shared commitment to multilateralism and a strong collective desire to join the international community, the countries of ASEAN and the ASEAN community itself have prospered. That success is chiefly a testament to the vision, determination, and incredible hard work of the people of Southeast Asia. Yet one essential outside factor which facilitated the stunning emergence of Asia was the far-sighted fact that the post-World War II rules-based international order was expressly designed by its founding countries, one of which was Canada, to allow other nations, emerging powers, to join. This was very much an open community. And join you have. The past 25 years have seen the rapid rise of Asia and the global South, as major economic powers in their own right. We created the G20 with Canadian leadership, I might add. The 5 founding ASEAN countries, including, of course, Singapore, joined the WTO in 1995. By 2013, all 10 ASEAN countries were WTO members. India has been a WTO member since 1995, China since 2001. Here in Asia, in Latin America, in the Caribbean, in Africa, developing countries have joined the post-Second World War institutions and accepted their rules. And that has delivered ever higher living standards to your people. Just look around us here in beautiful Singapore, where I had a chance to go for a run this morning along the Singapore River, and it really, really is a beautiful city. This is a country that thrives thanks to a global political and economic system underpinned by respect for international laws and institutions. South Korea's rise, emerging from the ashes of war to become a democratic, prosperous country, is another striking example. Another remarkable illustration of progress was the Malaysian election this spring, when Malaysians peacefully exercised their right to vote and opted for a change in government. But although the expansion of the rules-based international order was and remains a broadly positive evolution, with extraordinary gains in terms of reducing extreme poverty, lengthening lifespans, and decreasing infant mortality, one assumption about this global shift turned out to be wrong. This was the idea that as authoritarian countries joined the global economy and grew rich, they would inevitably adopt greater political freedoms too. That hasn't always happened. Indeed, in recent years, some democracies have even gone in the other direction and slid into authoritarianism, notably and tragically in my hemisphere, Venezuela. And some countries that had embarked on the difficult journey from communism to democratic capitalism have moved backwards. The saddest personal example for me is Russia. Even China, whose economic success in lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty is one of the great accomplishments of recent times, stands as a rebuke to our belief in the inevitability of liberal democracy. The same might be said of the troubling elections held in Cambodia over the weekend. And within the club of wealthy Western democracies, we're seeing homegrown anti-democratic movements on the rise. Liberal democracy is also under assault from abroad. Authoritarian regimes are actively seeking to undermine us with sophisticated, well-financed propaganda and espionage operations. They seek to suborn smaller countries, those wavering between democracy and authoritarianism. The idea that democracy could falter or be overturned in places where it had previously flourished may seem outlandish. But other great civilizations have risen and then fallen. It is hubris to think we will inevitably be different. Our Prime Minister likes to say about my country that Canada didn't happen by accident and it won't continue without effort. The same can be said of democracy itself. Let's set aside the malevolent foreign actors for a moment. Why are our liberal democracies vulnerable at home? Here's why. Populism thrives where the middle class is hollowed out, where people are losing ground and losing hope, even as those at the very top are doing better than ever. The fact is, working class families, middle class families aren't wrong to feel left behind. In the industrialized West, median wages have been stagnating. Jobs are becoming more precarious, pensions uncertain, housing, childcare, and education harder to afford. These are the wrenching human consequences, the growing pains, if you will, of the great transformative forces of the past 40 years, the technology revolution and globalization. Of the two, technology is having the greatest impact. But even free traders like me need to recognize that globalization has contributed as well. So, what's the answer? I think we are agreed that it is not, as the Luddites unsuccessfully proposed at the start of the Industrial Revolution, to stop the march of technology. We all love our smartphones too much. And I'm Canadian, so in my case, the smartphone is a BlackBerry. In fact, 2 of them. When it comes to trade, we do need to introduce labor standards with real teeth, as Canada and its partners in the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, have done. The labor chapter that we pushed for requires that the basic workers' rights included in the International Labor Organization 1998 Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work be reflected in law and practice. Canada is proud to be a member of the CPTPP and is swiftly moving forward with our implementation and ratification. We're eager to deepen our trading relationship with ASEAN, including through a Canada-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. And it is long past time to bring the WTO up to date with the realities of 2018 and beyond. We need to seriously address non-tariff barriers to trade and forced technology transfers. However, and overwhelmingly, the chief answer to the legitimate grievances of the middle class lies in domestic policy. The middle class and the people working hard to join it need the security that comes from educating your youth, health care for your family, good jobs for your children, and dignity in your retirement. We need to think about what the jobs of the future for our citizens will be and ensure that those jobs will pay a living wage and that our people have the skills to do them. Perhaps most importantly, and this is work that would benefit from international cooperation, we need to ensure that in a 21st century in which capital is global, but social welfare is national, each of our countries has the durable tax base necessary to support the 99%. In addressing these challenges at home, we in the West would be wise to look east for inspiration. The optimism and self-confidence here on the streets of Singapore, for example, surely owe a lot to domestic policies that seek to create broadly shared economic opportunity and push back against income inequality. As Prime Minister Lee put it earlier this year in reply to a parliamentary question, and I quote, "The issues of mitigating income inequality, ensuring social mobility, and enhancing social integration are critical. If we fail, if rising income inequalities result in a rigid and stratified social system, with each class ignoring the others or pursuing its interests at expense of others, our politics will turn vicious, our society will fracture, and our nation will wither." I could not agree more. But setting our own house in order is just one part of the struggle. The truth is that authoritarianism is on the march, and it's time for liberal, open societies to fight back. To do that, we need to raise our game. One device strongmen use to justify their rule is the Soviet trick of whataboutism, the strategy of false equivalency that holds that because democracies are inevitably imperfect, they lack the moral authority to criticize authoritarian regimes. We must be smart enough to see through this species of cynical rhetoric. It's possible, indeed necessary, for liberal Democrats to acknowledge that our democracies aren't perfect. The record of my own country's relationship with indigenous peoples, for example, is one of tragic failure. But admitting our mistakes doesn't discredit us. On the contrary, it is one of the things that make us who we are. Authoritarianism is also often justified as a more efficient way of getting things done. No messy, contested elections, no wrenching shift from one short-termist government to another, no troublesome judicial oversight, no time-consuming public consultation. How much more effective, the apologists argue, for a paramount leader with a long-term vision, unlimited power, and permanent tenure to rule. We need to resist this corrosive nonsense. We need to summon Yeats's oft-cited passionate intensity in the fight for liberal democracy and the international rules-based order that supports it. We need to resist foreign efforts to hijack our democracies through cyber meddling and propaganda. We need to outshine the other models and encourage those who are the fence. And we need to govern with integrity. Facts matter. Truth matters. Competence and honesty among elected officials and in our public services matter. And let me pause for a moment to emphasize the importance of an independent, ethical, and effective public service, and to pay tribute to the outstanding Canadian public servants I have the privilege to work with every day. Thank you very much. Since the end of the Second World War, we've worked together in an effort to build a system that promoted prosperity and prevented smaller and regional conflicts from turning into total wars. We've worked to build a system that championed freedom and democracy over authoritarianism and oppression. Canada will always stand up in defense of that system when it is under attack, and we will defend those who suffer most when the rules-based international order is violated. Which brings me to the plight of the Rohingya. A campaign of violence by Myanmar's military has forced over 720,000 Rohingya to flee their homes. The Rohingya are the target of ethnic cleansing, of horrific, organized attacks which have included the systemic use of rape and appalling violence and slaughter. And I have been to visit some of the Rohingya in the camp in Bangladesh and heard directly some of the most wrenching personal testimony, including of the use of rape as a weapon, which I have heard in my life. Beyond the grave human toll of these crimes, they are having a devastating effect on Myanmar's fragile transition to democracy. Canada has pledged $300 million over 3 years to help the Rohingya and to support Bangladesh, which is providing them sanctuary very generously. Our partners here in Southeast Asia, in particular those who have demonstrated the promise of diverse and inclusive societies, can and must lead the efforts to bring peace and reconciliation to Myanmar and to deliver justice for the Rohingya. One of the hard-won lessons of the bloody 20th century was the recognition that the protection of human rights is a prerequisite for peace. That dearly bought epiphany led to the creation of one of the documents that underpins the rules-based international order, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whose first article states that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. That assertion was written 70 years ago. It's reasonable to ask if the wisdom that gave us the Declaration, and which has precipitated an unprecedented era of international cooperation embodied in organizations like ASEAN, is still relevant today. I am certain that it is, and for some new reasons. Consider the fact that today, China produces nearly 20% of the world's GDP, and in our lifetime, its economy is set to become the world's largest. The ASEAN economic community is currently the third largest economy in Asia and the fifth largest in the world. Its combined GDP is just a bit higher than that of Canada. The rise of the emerging powers, very much including the countries of Southeast Asia, has been a chapter in the story of the entire world's increased prosperity. And it is only natural that the 85% of people who live outside the rich, industrialized West should, over time, account for a greater and growing share of the world's wealth. That's a good thing. But that shift leaves the traditional powers with a dilemma. How shall we behave in a world we no longer dominate? One answer is to give up on the rules-based international order and to seek to survive in a Metternichian world defined not by common values, mutually agreed upon rules, and shared prosperity, but rather by a ruthless struggle between great powers governed solely by the narrow, short-term, and mercantilist pursuit of self-interest. Canada is the world's 10th largest economy, but we know we could never thrive in such a system. Nor, I think you will agree, with the middle power countries of ASEAN. The far wiser path and more enduring choice is to reform and renew the rules-based international order that we have built together. And in doing so, to require that all states, whether democratic or not, whether large or small, play by common rules. This is the difficult truth. As the West's relative might inevitably declines, now is the time when, more than ever, we must set aside the idea that might is right. Now is the time for us to plant our flag on the rule of law, so that the rising powers are induced to play by these rules too. Canada believes in multilateralism and in the rules-based international order. We know we have many allies here in Southeast Asia. Let's work together. Thank you.
Minister, thank you very much for your inspiring Fullerton lecture. You highlighted some of the threats to the rules-based international order, which has, among other things, facilitated the rise of Asia, as you said. You identified some important challenges, including assaults on democracy domestically and from abroad, the dangers following from the hollowing out of the middle class in industrialized countries. And you said it was time for liberal, open societies to start fighting back and to defend and even expand an order which should be characterized by common values, mutually agreed rules, and common prosperity. And of course, you spoke from your national perspective, from Canada in the Western Hemisphere, but what you said has great resonance in this region as well. I know that there are many amongst our guests who like to ask you questions, but maybe I could start the discussion with my own. It seems evident that among the challenges to the present order is the weakening of the international leadership of the United States, which has been so important in the post-1945 world. And that weakening has become, I think, much more apparent under the current American president. Last month, we saw the remarkable spectacle of the US president criticizing NATO while soon afterwards apparently cozying up to the Russian president. He has made difficulties for US allies and partners, as well as for geopolitical adversaries over trade. So I think the question from my perspective is how should the allies of the United States and partners of the US respond to this challenge? Should they trust in an eventual return to the American status quo ante, or should they develop a plan B to ensure their future security and prosperity and to protect the rules-based international orders that many of us see as being so vital? And if there is a plan B, what should that plan B be?
Okay, well, I'm glad you've started, Tim, with an easy, gentle, softball type question. I'm going to warn the other people you invite. No, well, look, let me start by being very clear about one thing. Canada and the United States share the world's longest unmilitarized border. And we have, I think, the world's most successful trading relationship. The United States sells more to Canada than it does to China, Japan, and the UK combined. We're the largest market for the US, and they are our largest market. We do about $2 billion of business with each other every day. And I think the mutual success of both of our countries is based in very large part about the fact that we have been able to benefit for all 150 years of Canada's history, speaking for Canada, from a relationship which has been so peaceful, so mutually beneficial. Few countries in the world have such good neighbors, and as I think people in this region, which has had such a troubled past, will appreciate, having a great neighbor is a very, very important starting point for prosperity at home. We're allies in NATO, we're allies in NORAD, and these are relationships which are ongoing and which we cherish. And when I referred, Tim, to the Vancouver Conference on Peace and Security in the Korean Peninsula, that was held in Vancouver, co-chaired by Canada and the United States. Having said that, I also referred in my lecture to this very big shift in geopolitical and geoeconomic power. which here in Singapore, I think you see even more clearly than we may see in Canada. You know, it's what Fareed Zakaria has described as the rise of the rest. And as I said, I think it is both natural and positive for the world that the 85% of people who live outside the rich industrialized West are doing better, are being more prosperous, are accounting for a greater share of the world's GDP. That's been good for everybody. What it does, though, mean is that the traditional powers inevitably are playing less of a dominant role. And this is something that has been going on for a while. I think we remember Barack Obama, who spoke about the United States leading from behind. So I think we need to understand that there are some deep historical and economic shifts, broadly positive in nature. And our job, you know, as politicians, as thinkers, is to figure out how to be sure that those shifts are positive for everybody. Having said all of that, there are certainly some areas where Canada has a different point of view from the current US administration. One example is climate change. Another example is some of our trading relationships. I referred to the TPP. And I think the approach in these areas needs to be for countries to continue to pursue what they think is the right course. So when it comes to the Paris Accords, we believe this is so important. You know, I have 3 kids. I can't imagine an issue more important than climate change. And we continue to work with our partners around the world, and we continue to hold the door very wide open for our American friends to say, you can come back in if and when you like. I think the approach to the TPP, and here I would really like to especially acknowledge Japanese leadership, has been exactly the right one too, which is to say, we think, and I'm now speaking for Canada, but also for the TPP 11 countries, we think this is an important agreement. We think that freer trade in the Asia-Pacific is essential. I think we all, the TPP 11, we were sad that this US administration did not want to go ahead with the TPP, but we knew that the right course for us was to move forward while very much keeping a space open for the United States were it to choose to reconsider and join us. And when it comes to the TPP, I think the best thing we can do is to make it an incredibly successful trading community and to demonstrate through our own success to, for us, our American neighbors, that it's a great idea and that they should come in and join us.
Thank you very much, Minister. I know that there'll be many here who would like to ask questions. If you'd like to ask something, could you please raise your hand? I will then identify you and the microphone will come to you. Ambassador Chan Heng-chi.
Thank you. Minister Freeland, I am an ambassador at large with the Foreign Ministry, but I ask this question as an academic because that's my other hat. And anyway, my foreign minister said, ambassadors at large are not civil servants. So
you're allowed to say what you really think?
Yeah.
That's excellent.
And actually, I found your speech very thought-provoking. It was very substantial. And I will ask you a question which also shows really I'm thinking through some ideas. You gave a very robust defense of the rules-based order and that democracy and liberal values undergird that order. Now, your last paragraph, the last part of your speech said that new powers are rising, we've got to learn to accommodate and have that conversation. It's very difficult because it's a contradiction. And I think we're seeing this here. As academics, and you, I know you, I've read a lot of what you wrote when you were with Financial Times. we talk about the changing global order, changing international order. We're seeing it as it is now, and it's being challenged. The rules base from the after World War II is being challenged by Russia, by China, the countries who say we didn't have a part in writing those rules. Now, as we see it, and the larger the power grows, the rising power becomes, the more challenging for the established powers. And it's getting ugly. Trade war is just one expression, but I think there's more. It's also, what do we do about, the sea lanes and, every other aspect? Are we going towards a version 2.0 of a Cold War again, which is values-based? Because if you are being very frank about it, how does the world order change? And how do you bargain, if at all?
Yeah, I do see you're allowed to speak your mind, and that's great. That is an excellent question, and I think it is maybe the biggest challenge. It's the biggest international. I feel like the biggest domestic challenge of the 21st century is the economic issue that I talked about, which is being sure that our prosperity is shared. And I quoted your Prime Minister because I know that that's something that Singapore is very conscious of as well. So I really do feel, at home, the thing that we as a Canadian government can do, most important thing to keep our democracy strong is to keep our middle class strong and confident in the future. And if we fail to do that, then all of this international summitry ultimately means nothing. But I think, Ambassador, you have identified one of the biggest challenges of the 21st century, which is, speaking as a member of parliament, as a citizen, as a minister of a country that believes profoundly in its liberal democratic values, we need to be frank about the reality that the rise of emerging powers, the growth of the global economy, means that the economic dominance of the liberal democracies in the world is growing smaller. We can be growing richer, each one of us, but the percentages are clear. And I don't think there is actually a contradiction in speaking up for and being very robust in explaining why, for my country, for Canada, liberal democracy is the right way to run our country, and at the same time also being very strong in speaking for a rules-based international order and a real embrace of multilateralism. I think the two actually are connected, and what it does require is a couple of things. That international order does need to be open to new entrants. The openness is what makes this shift the shift in relative economic weight both possible and something we can collectively accommodate, and also, frankly, makes my people more prosperous. Canadians benefit from the rise of Asia. You are our trading partners, and the richer you are, the more blackberries and other great Canadian products you're going to be buying, and that is a great thing. So, we really believe as Canadians, we're a trading nation. We believe in international trade. We believe that we have not just kind of an intellectual stake in the rise of the rest, but a real practical stake in the rise of the rest. What's important, though, is that this rules-based international order be one where everyone follows the rules, where might is not right. And, Canada geographically is a very big country. Economically, we're not small. But we realize as number 10 in the world, a world that goes back to great power conflicts is not a world that is great for us. I don't think it's a world that is great for Singapore or for the countries of ASEAN either. And then I think the final thing that I would say on this values issue that you identified, Ambassador, is I think it's important for political leaders from liberal democracies not to be timid in speaking up for our values. And, you know, as I said, you know, it can be easy to be dazzled by the effectiveness of authoritarian regimes. And speaking as a government leader in a liberal democracy, all of those constraints on the political leadership in a democracy are real constraints. They are real. They can, you know, make your life difficult. It's easy to dream when you're sitting in your office in government, you know, wow, wouldn't it be easier if I didn't have to deal, you know, we have, in Canada, we have question period every day. So every day we have an hour in Parliament when the opposition tortures us. My children have come a few times, and one of my daughters said, "It's so unfair. I know how hard you're working for Canadians, but the opposition asks questions which make it seem as if you're not doing the right things." I said, yeah, that's how it works. I used to be a journalist. So I have, you know, great theoretical sympathy for journalists. But I can tell you, having your feet held to the fire by journalists, it's hard. And so it's easy to kind of imagine that if government were liberated from those constraints, you could do more, you could achieve more. I personally don't want to live in a country like that. I actually was a student in the Soviet Union. I lived there for nearly a year. So I have a little bit of personal experience, albeit, you know, as a Westerner, what it's like. I don't want to live in a country like that. And I think that all of those challenges and constraints and limits on the democratically elected government in my country actually makes us better. And I think it's important for us, precisely as you say, Ambassador, at a time when we see the rise of authoritarian states, it's important for those of us who speak for democracies to speak strongly in favor of their virtues.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Surya.
I'm Surya from the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies here in Singapore. Minister, you have made a debatable point that the leaders of the present international order, namely the West, and the rest of the world, there's not much of a contradiction when the rest of the world, led by China, India, and other BRICS countries, are making also for calling for a new rules-based international order. But the point is, in this context, which countries in the Asian continent would you count among Canada's partners to redefine the present international order? Thank you.
Oh, that's like being asked which of my 3 children is my favorite. And that is a question they often ask me, and I always decline to answer it. But what I will say is Canada very much, you know, I am here to attend the ASEAN meetings. And Canada, we very much value our partnership with ASEAN as an organization. As I mentioned, we are kind of on the foothills of pursuing a free trade agreement with ASEAN. That's something that we are very supportive of and would like to work towards as quickly as possible. And then I do, you know, maybe want to take this opportunity to underscore the point with which I began, which is something that we really admire and appreciate and take strength from. In a lot of the countries of Southeast Asia, very much including Singapore, is the fact that this is a part of the world where there are diverse societies that work, diverse societies that embrace their diversity and that work hard in a very intentional way to ensure that that diversity is a strength. And as you know, there are a lot of countries in the world where that whole idea of having a diverse society, of living in a diverse community, is being questioned, where people are saying actually it's maybe even not possible for human beings to live in a society with people who have a different religion or language or culture. And for Canadians, one of our core values, and really at this point a core characteristic of who we are as Canadians, is we are a diverse society. And so having the example of countries, and many of the most successful diverse societies in the world are found here in Southeast Asia, having those examples out there too, that we can share experiences with and draw strength from, is really valuable for us.
Thank you. Sir.
Thank you. I am the ambassador of Mexico to Singapore. I'm very glad to have you here. Very enlightful lecture, honest, straightforward. And moving to a contribution from both sides of the Pacific, how do you envision the role of the new future Associate States members of the Pacific Alliance and the role that they will play in this new order between the two rims of the Pacific? Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Is it Nathan?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for being here. As you know, I was in Mexico about 10 days ago, and I saw President Peña, and also I met President-elect López Obrador. And Canada, our government in particular, has worked really hard to strengthen our partnership with Mexico. We share a continent, and we're very glad to be working so closely with you. And the Pacific Alliance is, Canada's sort of stepped up involvement in the Pacific Alliance is one example of that. We're very excited about the Pacific Alliance. I think, to go back to Tim's point, and the ambassador's point, this is a moment when it's easy to be worried that the forces of dissolution are stronger than the forces of building, and that the forces of unraveling are stronger than the forces of multilateralism, that protectionism is stronger than trade liberalization. The Pacific Alliance is one example that goes in the opposite direction, and Canada really is excited about, we have free trade agreements with all of the Pacific Alliance countries. We are also members with some of the Pacific Alliance countries, including Mexico in the TPP 11 and with Mexico in NAFTA, so we have very close trading relationships already. And I see the Pacific Alliance as a great opportunity to strengthen those trading relationships and bring in some of our partners from the other side of the Pacific too.
Thank you, Minister. Gentleman with the beard, 3 rows in from the back.
Thank you, Minister. Patrick Ripple, Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Thank you for your lecture. Listening to it, I couldn't help but to realize a couple of similarities between the Canadians and the Europeans, actually. You are both supporting and defending a rule-based international order, multilateralism per se, and you both have identified this region as one of your key partners. At the same time, both of you are being left out of some of the key forums, be it the East Asia Summit, the EDAMM+. So I would like to hear your Canadian perspective of how you can overcome this kind of disconnect between aspiration and reality, where you're somehow disconnected or bonded by certain limitations.
Well, that is another really good question. And when it comes to Europe, that's a real compliment. I think we feel very close to our European partners, particularly now that CETA, our free trade agreement with the EU, has entered into force. And in fact, during the negotiation of CETA, our chief negotiator and the EU chief negotiator got to a point where Mauro, the EU chief negotiator, said to Steve, ours, we're building such a close trading relationship, pretty soon you guys are actually going to be an EU member. And Steve said, okay, that's fine. Let's do everything but. So we feel very close to Europe, and that's a very good thing. On the East Asia Summit, look, there's an easy answer to that. I think Canada should be a member. And I would sort of point out a couple of things. One is we're a Pacific nation. You know, we are very much at home in this part of the world. And I do think, as I said in my lecture, that there is a lot that Canada and the countries of Southeast Asia have in common right now when it comes to the kind of trade and security architecture that we have a shared interest in building and renewing for the 21st century. So, you know, my answer to your question is, you know, we want in, and we think we have a positive and constructive role to play here. At the end of the day, of course, it's up to our partners in Southeast Asia to decide how much Canada they want. But I think we're a pretty great country to work with.
Sir, Mr. Andy Wong.
Thanks for remembering me and Dr. Tim Huxley. Thanks for your invitation as well for my first Fullerton lecture. My name is Andy Wong. I'm a fresh graduate from the University of Hull in History and Politics. I'm scheduled to go back to York this September for my master's, again in politics and history as well. My question is a simple one. You mentioned several times in your speech and your dialogue that might does not make right. How do you then suggest, in your opinion, that the defense of the rules-based international order be conducted against countries that are seen to be going against the grain without credible might, both militarily, economically, or in terms of diplomatic heft backing it up? Where does the respect for individual national sovereignty and destiny lie in balance with defending the international rules-based order cherished by some nations? Because not every nation might agree on it, so where's the compromise in that?
That is another really good question. And I will offer three answers. You know, the first is I do think that if you are a country like and Canada is such a country that believes in the rules-based international order, you need to appreciate that at the end of the day, hard power is sometimes necessary to defend that order. And our government has, for example, decided over time to increase our defense spending by 70%. And we have stepped up our military presence around the world. Canada is leading one of the 4 NATO battle groups in the Baltic states and Poland, the Enhanced Forward Presence battle groups. Canada is leading the battle group in Latvia. That is a direct response to Russian aggression in Ukraine. And it's something that our Prime Minister announced in July. We will continue to be there until 2023. We're proud to be there. That's important. Canada is present militarily in Ukraine. We are training Ukrainian men and women in uniform. And that is also an important expression of our support for the rules-based international order, one of the gravest breaches of which has been the Russian invasion of Ukraine, annexation of Crimea, and continued aggression in the Donbass. Canada believes very much in the importance of UN peacekeeping missions. And we are sending, beginning this summer, a considerable presence to Mali to participate in the UN peacekeeping mission in Mali. We have, as the Prime Minister announced in July, agreed to take on the command role of the UN training mission in Iraq. And I spoke about North Korea. That is another instance where actually deploying hard power is important. Canada was very pleased to be able to support with Canadian airplanes, the patrolling of ship-to-ship transfers. So, we and Canada has sent to take the number 2 role a Canadian officer for the command. So, we believe that it's important on the military side of things to back up the rules-based international order with hard power. And, we have to, put our troops where our values are, and we are doing that. So that's part 1 of the answer. Part 2 of the answer on trade is, I think I mentioned the WTO intentionally. It is an extremely important organization. I think we have tended in recent years to focus on the negotiating and expanding of the WTO side of things, and focused on issues like, difficult issues like the Doha round. I think that we should not overlook the dispute settlement role that the WTO plays, and that is absolutely essential today more than ever. And we shouldn't overlook the fact that actually it can work. I'm going to mention a very specific case right now, which will only have resonance for Canadians. But at the beginning of July, the WTO ruled in Canada's favor in a dispute over super calendar paper. That's like shiny, glossy paper you see in newspaper supplements. A dispute that we had with the United States. A WTO panel ruled overwhelmingly in our favor. And actually, the United States agreed and lifted the tariffs on Canadian supercalendar paper exporters to the United States. And Canadian companies which had faced a tariff are having their money returned. That is an example of the WTO working, of the rules-based international order working. And that's important, and I think we have to work hard to ensure that that mechanism functions. So those, for me, are some examples. And then I think, my third point that I would suggest is, in speaking up for multilateral institutions, for the rules-based international order, I don't want to convey an impression that I think these institutions are perfect as they are. Of course they're not. We are talking about institutions that have their roots in the post-World War II era. The world has changed a lot since then and continues to change. And I think we need to really focus a lot on reforming and updating these institutions so that they are fit for purpose for the realities of the 21st century.
Minister, I'm afraid that we've run out of time, so very sadly we have to bring this 30-second Fullerton lecture to an end, but thank you so much for answering those questions, which covered a very wide range of issues, so frankly and fully. We really appreciate that. And even more so, thank you very much for your really great Fullerton lecture. You dealt with one of the really central issues of 21st century international politics in a very stimulating and inspiring way. So very many thanks for that.
Thank you, Tim. It's great to be here. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you for the invitation.